Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Hot Coffee Consulting. Today I want to talk about identity solutions and identifiers. Now there's a huge amount of buzz and there's a huge amount of innovation in the marketplace at the moment around identity management and different types of identifier. And that's really great, but it can be quite a confusing ecosystem and it's fairly nascent technology. And so I thought I'd try to help to provide a framework and a way in which you can begin to evaluate and think critically about some of the identity management solutions that are coming out in the market. Now, before I go into the framework, I thought it's worthwhile giving a little bit of context as to why it is that it's important to discuss identity. Now, identity has been pretty much in a constant state of fluctuation for at least the past half decade. What I mean by that is we've had new identifiers coming into the market. We've had existing identifiers being slowly removed from the market. We've had new regulation and new policies governing the way in which we think about certain types of identifiers and the ways in which we work with certain types of identifiers. So it's been in a constant state of change. And we've learned to adapt and adjust as an industry to the way in which digital identifiers and non-digital identifiers can be used as instruments to facilitate personalization and media decisioning at scale. Now, one of the big step changes around identity happened in 2017, over 3 years ago, when Apple, Safari, and Mozilla Firefox introduced measures to remove third-party cookies from their browsing environments. Now that's important because third-party cookies have been for a very long time a quite commonly prescribed to form of digital identity. They were effectively underpinning the vast majority of data connections across the digital ecosystem and certainly within the programmatic supply chain. So third-party cookies were incredibly important. And in 2017, for various different reasons, Apple Safari and Mozilla Firefox introduced measures to restrict and ultimately to remove third-party cookies from their browsers. Now, at the time, Mozilla Firefox and Apple Safari represented around about 30 or 40% of total browser traffic. And so the industry recognized a direction of travel, but continued to move along and operate within the 60 to 70% of browser traffic that was supported by Google Chrome. Now, one of the big sea changes in the conversation around identity was at the beginning of this year, in January of this year, when Google Chrome announced that they too would be following suit and would be removing third-party cookies from their browser environment within the next 24 months. Now, that's important because it represents the other 60% or 70% of browser traffic, and it means that we as an industry have to find a solution and a replacement of the third-party cookie. So ever since that happened in January of this year, the industry's been very busy. Different businesses have been creating different solutions to try and counteract the loss of the third-party cookie, as well as to just develop better, more robust identity management solutions to support various different use cases. So there's a huge amount of activity at the moment, lots of different ad tech companies, various different organizations developing approaches to new identifiers, to different forms of identity management. And as I said, it can be quite confusing because some of these solutions are fairly new and the technology that underpins them is fairly nascent. So I've been thinking about this and having lots of different conversations with suppliers of these types of capability. And I've come up with a framework that I think can help people to understand how identity management solutions can play together, how they can interface with one another, and what the pros and the cons are to specific forms of identifier. I believe, as an aside, and a topic probably for another podcast, that moving forwards, there won't be a single identifier or a single identity solution that manages to meet all of the specific requirements of any given organization. And I think that what we're probably going to move towards is much more of a portfolio-based approach to identity, where we have various different identity solutions and identifiers that we use for specific purposes, and that we'll have to learn how to manage the interface between those identity solutions and where we use one for what purposes and how it's applied, and under what conditions we'll use other forms of identity, other forms of identifier. So that being said, the framework that I've come up with is what I call the 5P framework. So 5 points that I think help to evaluate identity solutions and identifiers for their pros and their cons. So the first P is privacy. Now, before we go on to discuss the various different nuances of identity management solution and the various different capabilities, there really has to be a minimum requirement, and that is that the solution is privacy compliant, that it complies and adheres to local law and regulation. Now, for the vast majority of businesses operating across the EEA, that's going to be compliance and adherence to the general data protection regulations and the principles that are outlined in that regulation. And for those operating in North America, it looks like it's going to be an alignment to an adherence to the Consumer Privacy Act, the California Consumer Privacy Act, that's coming into place in 2021 in North America. Those are the sort of standards that seem to be set for most Western markets. So there has to be, for any identity management solution that you're considering, an evaluation as to whether or not that solution meets the requirements that are set out within those documents, that it meets and adheres to local law and regulation with respect to privacy. So that's the sort of minimum requirement. The second P is persistence. So different identifiers will last for differing periods of time. One of the criticisms that was often leveled at third-party cookies was that they weren't robust and weren't particularly stable. In other words, they didn't last a particularly long period of time. You couldn't retain information for a particularly long period of time using a third-party cookie. So the half-life of a third-party cookie varies greatly, but could be on average anywhere between 1 and 7 days. That's how long you could retain information and action data against that particular identifier. Now that's perfectly fine for certain use cases, but may not be viable if you're looking to build a consistent line of communication with an individual over the course of several weeks or months. There are other identifiers that have much longer levels of persistence and are more stable over time. So things like mobile device identifiers and things like hashed email address tend to be very persistent over a long period of time, and they can accrue information over a long period of time. And so there'll be different identifiers, as I say, with different levels of persistence that last for different periods of time. And as a result of that, will be useful in different circumstances and different contexts. So we've got privacy, persistence. The third P is portability, which is another word for connectivity, really. How portable does the identifier that you're working with make your data set and your information? What we are always striving for is centralized distribution. So from an operational perspective, it's always optimal to have centralized distribution of audience insight and intelligence. And certain identifiers will facilitate distribution and portability to differing degrees. Certain identifiers will work particularly well within certain activation endpoints and not potentially within others. So it could be, for instance, that you'll have identifiers that work particularly well within search, within social, within marketing automation, but that don't work particularly well within digital display or within programmatic. It could be that there are certain identifiers that work particularly well for connected TV and OTT, but don't work within other environments. And so, again, understanding the identifier, understanding to what extent it supports and facilitates distribution of audience information and insight that's, generally speaking, collected centrally, it's an important part of the equation. So we have privacy, persistence, portability. The next P is penetration, or coverage, scalability really. So the extent to which an identifier can scale effectively to support personalization and media decisioning, creative and content decisioning over a broad set of individuals, devices, machines, whatever it may be. If you're looking to drive data-driven advertising, personalization at scale across many markets, for instance, you'll need an identifier that supports a level of scalability. And again, there are certain identifiers that have very strong persistence, very strong portability, but not necessarily high levels of scalability and high levels of penetration. And so there's oftentimes a trade-off between some of the aspects of identity, and scalability can certainly be one of those. The final P is precision. It's accuracy. So there are identity solutions that will work at differing degrees of accuracy. And by accuracy, what I mean here is the ability to identify an individual person. So there are identity solutions that will focus on identifying an individual person. There are identity solutions that focus on identifying a cluster of identities that represent maybe a household. And then there are identity solutions that focus on larger aggregations that could be location clusters, postal codes, higher levels of aggregation with larger groups of people within them. And again, there's no real right or wrong answer with respects to precision. It isn't always the case that just because an identifier is able to very accurately hone in and identify an individual person, that it will therefore be the best form of identity to use within any given scenario, any given situation. There is a trade-off, and there will be balances between precision, accuracy, penetration, and scalability, for instance. That's probably one of the larger trade-offs that will exist. Your ability to hone in and to find an individual will potentially affect your ability to scale. And so penetration is obviously really important. Precision is incredibly important, and those two things have to be balanced off against one another ultimately as you're building out this portfolio-based approach to identity. So that's the framework that I've been thinking about. That's the way that I've been framing my questions to identity management solutions, and the way that I've been evaluating identifiers as I've been having the conversation. And hopefully that will help you to have conversations with suppliers across the market too. Thank you very much for joining the session today, and I hope to see you again very soon.